Tonight, President Trump is on his way to Asia for a three-country trip. He left Joint Base Andrews last night for the nearly 24-hour journey. Late today, he announced new punishing tariffs on an ally.
Tarika, good evening to you. Tonight, President Trump says he's raising tariffs on some Canadian goods by another 10%. The punishing increase coming as he travels to Asia to meet with world leaders, including China's President Xi.
U.S. President Donald Trump is once again raising tariffs on Canada, this time in response to Ontario's anti-tariff TV ad campaign that's airing in the U.S. this weekend, but is set to be pulled from the airwaves on Monday. That ad includes a clip from former President Ronald Reagan.
It begins with a moment of quiet urgency. Imagine the sun rising over the Great Lakes region, freight trains rumbling and factories humming, and beneath it all, one of the world's most stable and trusted trading relationships quietly unraveling. This is not a minor skirmish. This is a tectonic shift. And it's happening right now between two near neighbors, once partners, the United States and Canada. Picture this. The President of the United States, in a post on his social platform, announcing that as of today, he is imposing an extra 10% tariff on Canadian goods. Not a threat, an executed decision. The stated cause, what he calls a hostile act by a Canadian province, Ontario, which aired a television ad during the World Series. That ad referenced a speech by former President Ronald Reagan, advocating free trade. That very ad, the president declared, misrepresented the facts, attempted to sway U.S. trade policy, and therefore the United States must defend itself. The tweets posted, "The threads of diplomacy cut. Trade talks terminated. No meeting planned with the Canadian Prime Minister at an upcoming international summit. Just a straight line from an ad to tariffs to termination of negotiation." Why does this matter? For the shoppers paying more at the register. For the manufacturers whose supply chains run cross-border. For entire industries, automotive, lumber, aluminum, energy, built on the assumption of North American integration. And for the grander picture, a world where the mantle of trusted ally is no longer given for granted. As we dive in, let's unpack the what, the why, the how, and the what comes next. Because this is not just about tariffs, it's about trust, strategic alignment, economic tensions, and national identity. On October 25, 2025, President Donald Trump announced via social media that the U.S. will raise tariffs on imports from Canada by an additional 10% on top of existing levies. The trigger? A television advertisement sponsored by Ontario's provincial government. The ad deployed excerpts from a 1987 address by Ronald Reagan about the dangers of trade barriers. The president characterized it as fraud and a hostile act, alleging Canada hoped the U.S. Supreme Court might intervene in its favor. He then terminated trade negotiations with Canada. The timing matters. Canada and the U.S. have been under strain all year. Earlier in 2025, the U.S. had already imposed steep tariffs on Canadian goods not covered by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA. The supply chain complexity that underpins the North American economy has been under increasing pressure. To fully understand the move, we need to peer behind the rhetorical curtain. Several factors seem to converge. There's economic grievance. The U.S. complains that Canada benefits from favorable treatment, undercuts American producers, and maintains tariffs or trade barriers on certain U.S. goods like dairy eggs and poultry. There are border and security concerns. The Trump administration frames this as not simply trade, but national security, with issues like illegal immigration and fentanyl trafficking folded into the rationale behind earlier tariffs. Then there's symbolic provocation. The ad triggered this escalation, an advert featuring Reagan becoming the spark. Whether intentional or not, the ad provided a pretext. Domestic politics also plays a part. A hardline stance like this energizes certain political constituencies and sends a message abroad. Disrupt America's interests and you'll pay. And finally, there's the redefinition of alliances. The U.S.-Canada relationship has long been considered among the most stable in the world. But when one side perceives the deal as skewed, the tensions reveal deeper questions. What does partnership mean in this era of reshaping global trade? What does a 10% additional tariff actually mean? On the surface, it raises the cost of Canadian imports into the US, putting pressure on Canadian exporters. But it cascades across sectors. In manufacturing, many US factories rely on Canadian parts, raw materials, lumber, aluminum, or energy. If tariffs increase input costs, US manufacturers may suffer. Consumers buying Canadian goods may see higher prices. Canadian exporters may shift costs onto buyers, or US firms may absorb them and reduce margins. The Canadian economy, heavily reliant on exports, takes a direct hit. The added burden challenges Canada's export-oriented sectors, undermining their access to the US market. Diplomatically, trade talks have been terminated, signaling a breakdown in one of North America's core mechanisms of cooperation. Regionally, the shock spreads across the continent. Mexico and the US are also tied into this ecosystem. Investors, supply chain managers, and governments sit up and take notice. Canada cannot sit idly by. Historically, Canada has responded to US tariffs with its own countermeasures. Earlier in 2025, when the US first slapped large tariffs, Canada announced its own on billions of dollars worth of American goods. In this case, Ontario's government quickly announced it would suspend the ad campaign partly to reopen trade talks. But the larger posture remains. Canada is ready to resume negotiations, yet the relationship now bears visible scars. It's easy to think, well, this is just Canada. What's the big deal? But that overlooks three crucial realities. First, cost to Americans. When a trusted trading partner is in conflict with your country, Americans end up paying more, either via higher prices, lower wages, or diminished choices. Second, supply chain fragility. North American manufacturing is deeply integrated. A shock anywhere in that chain reverberates everywhere. The US auto industry, for example, uses Canadian-made parts. A tariff, disruption, or retaliatory move can slow down US plants. Third, alliance credibility. If Canada, the closest neighbor and an historic ally, is treated as an adversary, other trading partners will wonder if they're next. The ripple effect isn't just economic, it's geopolitical. This escalation signals a broader shift in how trade, diplomacy, and security now interlink. Trade is no longer simply commerce. It's become an instrument of statecraft. The US is increasingly using tariffs as leverage for other issues: security, immigration, supply chain realignment. We are also seeing a re-regionalization of economic blocs. The USMCA was meant to lock in North American integration, but now questions arise. Is Canada drifting away from the US? Are new rivalries emerging? And unpredictability has become the new norm. When trade sanctions are triggered by a provincial ad, not by macroeconomic policy, predictability vanishes. Companies can plan for 10, 20, or 30% tariffs, but not for symbolic provocations. And then there's the trust deficit. For decades, US-Canada cooperation was a case study in mutual confidence. That trust is being tested. Other countries are watching and hedging. If the US treats its neighbor this way, what about us? The magnitude of this could grow. Several risks loom. Escalation into a broader trade war. Canada could retaliate more severely, and the conflict might spread to sectors like energy, mining, forestry, and technology. Supply chain relocation. US firms could re-evaluate sourcing from Canada, shifting jobs elsewhere. Consumer backlash. Americans accustomed to stable, low-cost trade might push back against rising prices, while Canadian consumers could boycott US goods. Political fallout. Canada's domestic politics might pivot further away from Washington, affecting cooperation on climate, security, and intelligence. And globally, the signal this sends is stark. If you're Japan, Korea, the UK, or the EU, you're watching a lesson unfold. Even the closest allies can become trade adversaries overnight. Where do we go from here? A handful of possibilities stand out. Negotiations might restart. Canada and the US could return to the table, perhaps with a new framework. The suspension of the Ontario ad suggests willingness to talk, but rebuilding trust will take time. A partial de-escalation could happen. Tariffs might be trimmed or delayed, yet the threat would linger. A full blow-up remains possible. If retaliation escalates, we could see a tit-for-tat dynamic, higher tariffs, more countries drawn in, supply chain disruption, and broader economic pain. Or we might see structural realignment, Canada turning more toward Europe, Asia-Pacific, or alternative markets, while US firms diversify supply chains. The North American economic landscape could shift permanently. Let's not lose sight of the people behind the numbers. On the Canadian side, factory workers in Ontario worry about export markets. Farmers in Manitoba fear losing access to their biggest customer. On the American side, auto plant employees in Michigan or Wisconsin depend on Canadian-made parts. Suburban families may see higher prices on groceries, furniture, or cars. This is personal, not abstract. Take a lumber yard in British Columbia that relies on US builders sourcing timber from them. Facing higher tariffs, they must either absorb costs, raise prices, or cut jobs. Meanwhile, a US manufacturing plant in Ohio might find that a single small component from Canada now costs more, delaying production and reducing margins, potentially shortening worker hours. The pain radiates in both directions. If you're watching this because you care about global trends, here's what matters. Global trade is volatile. What once seemed stable can be disrupted overnight. Economic decisions are now political. Trade policy intersects with immigration, security, and even media campaigns. Your job, your supply chain, your cost of living, these can all be affected even if you don't realize it. Alliances matter deeply. When they fray, the ripple effects reach beyond economics. They reshape strategy, diplomacy, and daily life. And the key lesson: stay alert, because companies will change shipping routes, governments will renegotiate treaties, and industries will shift production faster than the news cycle can keep up. And as the dust settles on this latest US-Canada showdown, one thing is clear: this is not just another trade dispute. It's a test of strength, of leadership, and of survival in a world where economic power is the new weapon of choice. Both nations are standing firm, but the real question is, for how long? As tariffs rise, factories slow, and tempers flare, the North American dream is being rewritten right before our eyes. Only time will tell whether this ends in reconciliation or a rupture that reshapes the future of the continent.